In 1987, archivists at the South Carolina Historical Society uncovered a leather-bound ledger that had been sealed away for over a century. Inside, written in precise, almost obsessive handwriting, were hundreds of entries from the 1840s, tracking births, deaths, physical traits, and so-called genetic improvements across 17 plantations in the Charleston area. The 847 entries read less like family records and more like livestock catalogs, with notes on height, strength, appearance, and breeding potential. The most chilling details appeared in the final pages, where plantation owners discussed selective breeding programs that yielded profits triple those of cotton. Hidden in those yellowed pages was evidence of a calculated system of cruelty that operated in plain sight for nearly 2 decades, a conspiracy later known as the Charleston Breeding Initiative. For years, powerful families fought to keep these documents buried successfully, lobbying to block their release until the 21st century. Charleston in the 1840s was one of the richest cities in the South. Its wealth built on enslaved labor and fertile rice plantations along the Ashley and Cooper rivers. The city's elite families like the Ravenels, Rutledges, Pinckneys, and Draytons gathered often at the Charleston Agricultural Society to share strategies not only on cotton and rice yields, but also on what they carefully referred to as labor optimization. It was within this circle that a young planter named Thomas Whitfield moved uneasily. His family had recently acquired the Millbrook estate just north of Charleston, which gave him entry into high society. But unlike his peers, Thomas had been educated at Harvard, where he absorbed abolitionist thought and new ideas about human rights. Outwardly, he played the role of a proper Southern gentleman, but privately he recoiled at the practices he saw. His position allowed him to observe what others took for granted, and by his first year back in Charleston, he realized that beneath the veneer of refinement lay a system of staggering brutality. In the summer of 1843, during the height of Charleston's social season, he attended a gathering at the Ravenel Mansion. There, he overheard Dr. Edmund Ravenel, a respected physician and patriarch of the family, whispering with Colonel James Rutledge about what they called the Breeding Initiative. The fragments Thomas caught phrases like genetic improvement, selective pairing, and enhanced productivity were enough to unsettle him deeply. From that night on, he began listening more carefully at each gathering, and what he uncovered would forever change the way he saw his city, his class, and his own family's place in this dark chapter of history. As autumn settled over Charleston, Thomas began piecing together a pattern that turned his unease into outright dread. The very families who boasted of their championship horses and award-winning cattle were applying the same breeding principles to the enslaved men and women they owned. They spoke casually of bloodlines, of pairing traits they deemed desirable, and of eliminating those they saw as weaknesses. Their tone carried the same detached precision one might expect at an agricultural lecture, but the subject was human lives. The horror of what Thomas had been hearing reached its peak during a December gathering at the Drayton estate. The main house glowed with warm lamplight against the sharp winter air as Charleston's elite gathered for their annual harvest celebration. Thomas arrived late, as was the custom, but tucked inside his coat, he carried a leather-bound journal now filled with notes from months of overheard conversations. That night, however, his journal would capture more than whispers. When the older men retreated to Colonel Drayton's study for cigars and brandy, Thomas quietly slipped outside, choosing the garden paths under the excuse of needing air. The December chill drove other guests inside, leaving him alone in the shadows beneath the study window. Through the cracked glass, the voices carried clearly. Dr. Edmund Ravenel's steady voice dominated the room as he read what sounded like an official report. The results from our 3-year initiative have exceeded all projections, he declared. Millfield Plantation has produced 17 births from selected pairings, showing an average height increase of 2 inches over the previous generation. More importantly, the children display stronger physiques and greater resistance to illness. Papers shuffled, and Colonel James Rutledge added his own findings. The Pinckney estate has had similar success. Their focus on docility paired with physical endurance has produced remarkable results. The new generation shows a quarter less resistance to instruction while retaining superior strength. Thomas's hand shook as he tried to capture the words in his journal. But it was Colonel Drayton's voice that nearly made him drop the pencil. "Gentlemen," Drayton said with satisfaction, "we are no longer talking about isolated plantation experiments. Our network now spans Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. With carefully maintained records, we track bloodlines across state borders, creating combinations that would have been impossible in isolation." A chair scraped, followed by the sound of footsteps. Thomas pressed himself hard against the cold brick, his breath held tight in his chest. Drayton's voice carried again, deliberate and calm. "I have before me the quarterly reports from our partners. The Bennings estate in Georgia reports 43 births under our protocols. These children are already being evaluated for distribution across the network, each assigned according to their projected abilities." In that moment, Thomas realized the full truth. This was no secret experiment confined to Charleston. It was an organized multi-state enterprise with a scope larger and more calculated than he had ever imagined. Thomas felt his stomach twist as the scale of what he was hearing came into focus. These men weren't just experimenting with people, they were running a coordinated enterprise that stretched across multiple states, deliberately breeding human beings for traits like strength, obedience, and endurance, then distributing the children as if they were market goods. Dr. Ravenel returned to the conversation, explaining their strict documentation protocols. Every birth had to be recorded with measurements, family lineage, and an assessment of projected value. According to him, their ledgers already contained records on more than 800 individuals, enough data to map breeding combinations 5 years into the future. For the next hour, Thomas listened in frozen silence as they laid out the machinery of their system. They spoke of breeding houses, where young women were confined for reproduction stud selections, where men were chosen like prize animals, and evaluations of children who were graded the way farmers judged a crop. The worst detail came in the form of a euphemism that made Thomas's hands shake. Children deemed unfit for their standards were redirected to standard agricultural operations. A phrase he understood meant torn from their families and sent to labor camps where survival rates were grim. When the meeting finally broke up, Thomas stayed hidden in the cold garden until the last carriage had departed. What he had overheard was no isolated cruelty. It was a business. It had structure, record-keeping profit margins, and coordination between some of the most powerful families in the South. Walking back to his plantation that night, Thomas made a choice that would change his life. He would stop being a passive witness. He would infiltrate the network, gather evidence, and one day expose it to the world. What he did not yet realize was that the truths he uncovered would be so grotesque that even hardened abolitionists would doubt them. In the weeks after that December night, Thomas shifted from silent observer to deliberate infiltrator. He quickly learned that the group, what he began calling the Breeding Consortium, shielded its core operations with layers of secrecy. Members corresponded in codes, rotated private meeting places, and stored their most incriminating ledgers far from their main estates. Cracking through that armor of secrecy would not be easy. His first real opening came from his friendship with William Pinckney, the brash, youngest son of one of the founding families. At just 22, William had been recently initiated into what his father described as advanced agricultural operations. Unlike his calculating elders, William's youth made him reckless, especially after too many drinks. One evening over cards and whiskey at the Charleston Club, William bragged freely about his family's innovations in labor management. With a careless grin, he let slip a phrase that made Thomas's pulse thunder in his ears. The Pinckney estate, he said, maintained breeding quarters, housing built for the sole purpose of their selective human breeding program. William's careless boasting gave Thomas the first real glimpse of how vast the conspiracy truly was. Not only did the Pinckneys maintain specialized breeding quarters, but William revealed that his father had entrusted him with access to the master registry, a massive ledger that tracked bloodlines, breeding histories, and what they described as genetic improvements across the entire network. Thomas knew that if he could get his hands on that book, it would be the smoking gun proof that this was not rumor or isolated cruelty, but an organized multi-state system. But the task was perilous. The registry was kept in a locked safe in the plantation's main office under the control of senior family members. The breeding quarters themselves were in a remote part of the estate, strictly guarded and off-limits to all outsiders. Thomas spent months preparing, weaving himself deeper into the Pinckney family's confidence. He began courting William's sister Margaret initially as a calculated ploy. Their relationship gave him excuses to linger at the estate, attend dinners, stay overnight, and gradually learn the rhythms of the household. What began as deception soon grew into something far more complicated. Margaret was intelligent, independent, and quietly sympathetic to ideas of reform. Against his better judgment, Thomas found himself falling for her, blurring the line between strategy and genuine affection. Through these visits, Thomas pieced together details that chilled him. About 40 women lived in the breeding quarters, selected between the ages of 16 and 30, for what the Pinckneys deemed prime reproductive traits. Their conditions were more comfortable than on typical plantations, better food, cleaner housing, access to doctors. But these comforts masked the reality of absolute control. Every aspect of their lives was managed for one purpose: reproduction. Men chosen for the program were rotated between plantations in the network, their movements tracked to balance diversity with desired traits. The network kept meticulous records, health charts, family lineages, even notes on temperament. Children born to the program were examined immediately, and those who matched specific criteria were placed in special nurseries. The rest were separated from their mothers and reassigned to other plantations, their lives predetermined before they could walk. By spring of 1844, Thomas had mapped enough of the system to risk everything. Margaret let slip that her father would be traveling to Georgia for a regional meeting of the network, leaving only the overseer in charge. That absence would give Thomas the narrow window he needed. On a humid May night, as a thunderstorm rolled over the low country, Thomas slipped across the soaked grounds of the Pinckney estate. Lightning cracked overhead, masking the sound of his movements as he made his way toward the main office and the breeding quarters. What he uncovered that night would forever change his understanding of the conspiracy. The master registry didn't just contain Charleston's records, it held correspondence and data from Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, and as far west as Mississippi. The operation was not local. It was a coordinated industrial-scale network stretching across the South. And in the breeding quarters, Thomas would see with his own eyes the human suffering behind the sterile calculations of the ledgers, a reality even darker than the words he had copied into his journal. With Margaret resting upstairs and her father away in Georgia, the Pinckney estate was unusually quiet. Thomas slipped through the formal gardens toward the cluster of buildings the family called their specialized agricultural facilities, though he already knew the truth of what they housed. The breeding quarters formed a compound of 6 structures built neatly around a central courtyard. Unlike the rough slave cabins common across the South, these buildings were sturdier, ventilated, and carefully maintained. Thomas understood immediately that this was not kindness. It was strategy. Well-fed, healthy women produced healthier children, and healthier children meant greater profits. He crept to the first dormitory, peering through a set of half-opened shutters. Inside, rows of beds stretched in regimented lines, each one occupied by a young woman. The silence struck him as unnatural. No whispers, no shuffling, only the steady sound of controlled breathing. Later, Thomas would learn that sedatives were administered nightly, ensuring compliance and preventing conversations that might inspire resistance or escape. The second building revealed something even more unsettling. Examination tables, measuring devices, and medical tools lined the room, looking more like a veterinary clinic than a space for human care. Charts covered the walls, detailing menstrual cycles, pregnancy schedules, nutrition logs, and health data. Every detail of the women's bodies had been reduced to figures and predictions, controlled with cold precision. But it was the third building, the nursery and evaluation center, that left Thomas nearly shaking. Here, newborn children were weighed, measured, and sorted into categories. Charts classified them not only by physical strength and health, but also by behavioral assessments and projected economic worth. Infants labeled as premium were set aside for specialized care and grooming, while others were marked for standard agricultural deployment, a phrase Thomas understood as a life of grueling labor far from their mothers. When Thomas finally reached the plantation office and unlocked the master registry, he realized the true magnitude of what he was facing. The ledger documented 147 individuals across 17 plantations. Each entry detailing physical attributes, health histories, and family trees stretching back 3 generations. Planned breeding schedules mapped out years into the future, with specific pairings designed to amplify favored traits or erase what the consortium deemed undesirable. Even more damning were the letters filed alongside the registry. Correspondents from Georgia celebrated strong outcomes and suggested exchanging genetic stock to maximize results. Partners in Virginia outlined new evaluation methods and pitched joint ventures. A plantation in Mississippi included detailed financial projections proving that selective breeding programs produced profits nearly 3 times greater than cotton cultivation. Other letters discussed ambitions to expand into Texas and Arkansas, where cheap land and lack of scrutiny would allow the network to grow unchecked. By candlelight, Thomas copied page after page, each word confirming what he now knew beyond doubt. This was not just slavery, it was slavery re-engineered, industrialized, and justified under the guise of agricultural science. The network's leaders didn't see their work as cruelty. They saw it as innovation. And their confidence, their arrogance, made clear that they had no intention of stopping. The letters Thomas uncovered went beyond bloodlines and births. Some described experiments in training and education designed to create not only stronger laborers, but skilled workers who could fetch premium prices in Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. Carpenters, blacksmiths, seamstresses, children were being shaped for markets as if they were crafted goods. Thomas spent 4 hours hunched over the master registry, his hand cramping as he copied names, charts, and correspondence by the flicker of a single candle, while thunder rolled across the low country. By dawn, he had enough evidence to damn the entire enterprise. But evidence alone would not be enough. The letters revealed judges, legislators, and leading businessmen among the network's members. These were men who controlled courts, newspapers, and banks. To challenge them meant going against the very pillars of South Carolina society. Thomas knew he would need not just proof, but a strategy capable of cutting through their power and privilege. He slipped back across the rain-soaked grounds before first light, already rehearsing his next steps. Yet what Thomas did not know was that his movements had not gone unnoticed. A young servant girl awake in the main house had seen him in the gardens and quietly reported what she witnessed. By the time Thomas reached Millbrook Estate, forces were already in motion against him. The following morning, Colonel Drayton arrived without warning. He was not alone. At his side stood two men, Dr. Samuel Huger, introduced as a specialist in plantation security, and a grim figure known only as Mr. Crawford, whose scarred hands and ice-cold stare spoke of violent experience. They joined Thomas at his breakfast table, turning the familiar comfort of his own dining room into a stage of veiled menace. Drayton's words were polite, even jovial, but his gaze carried the weight of a threat. "Thomas, my boy, we've grown concerned about certain irregularities in our agricultural operations. It seems someone has been showing an unusual curiosity about our private business methods." His smile never faltered, yet his eyes locked on Thomas with the precision of a predator. Dr. Huger leaned forward, his tone clinical, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Whitfield, we have reason to believe someone within our circle has been recording conversations and perhaps even gaining access to confidential materials. Such actions are not only breaches of trust, they endanger legitimate business ventures." The accusation lingered in the air, sharp and heavy. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He realized that while Margaret had opened the door to the Pinckney estate, she had also placed him under the scrutiny of men who could not afford exposure. One wrong word would unmask him. Forcing calm, he chose confused innocence, feigning ignorance, while carefully probing for what they truly knew. Inside, though, he understood the danger had shifted. He was no longer simply observing the conspiracy, he was now entangled in its deadly web. Crawford's silence had been more menacing than words, his cold eyes never leaving Thomas, as though he were calculating exactly how much force it would take to silence him. Thomas knew the man's presence was no accident. He was there to make sure the meeting ended one of two ways, with an ally gained or a problem erased. Choosing his words with surgical precision, Thomas leaned into a calculated performance. He claimed he too had been uneasy about whispers he'd overheard at social gatherings, fragments of conversations about unusual agricultural methods. Perhaps he suggested someone was gathering intelligence for rival planters, or worse, for federal investigators. The response had the effect he hoped for. Colonel Drayton and Dr. Huger exchanged quick, uncertain glances, reassessing whether Thomas was a liability or someone useful. When pressed, Thomas admitted he had overheard talk of breeding protocols and genetic improvements, enough to suspect that outsiders might be trying to steal their secrets. By doing so, he revealed just enough knowledge to show awareness, while framing himself as protective rather than dangerous. Dr. Huger leaned in, his words calm, but edged with warning. "Thomas, what you've described shows you understand the revolutionary nature of our work. Years of science money and discipline have gone into these methods. If the wrong people got hold of them, abolitionists, politicians, they would twist them into lies and slander. That is why we must be vigilant." His clinical tone carried the same cold detachment the network used when discussing human lives as though they were crops. For 2 tense hours the conversation circled. Bit by bit the truth emerged. The network had already marked Thomas as a risk. Margaret Pinckney's maid, Sarah, a young woman born into the breeding program itself, had seen him moving through the grounds during the storm and reported his actions. He had been watched ever since, his loyalties weighed like grain on a scale. At last Crawford spoke, his voice steady and low, the words edged with finality. "Mr. Whitfield, we know you accessed the Pinckney office 2 nights ago. We know you copied pages from the registry. That information could ruin families, ruin the state itself. But Dr. Huger believes you may be more useful inside than out. With your Harvard education and your family's new estate, you could help us refine our methods, expand our network." He paused, his stare unblinking. "So we offer you a choice. Join us as a partner or accept the consequences." The consequences needed no explanation. Crawford's scarred hands and unshakable calm spoke louder than threats ever could. Thomas's mask of composure barely held as he nodded, requesting time to consider their proposal. Inside, he knew his decision was more than personal. His answer would determine whether he could find a way to dismantle the breeding consortium from within, or whether he would be buried alongside its secrets. As the heavy footsteps of Drayton Huger and Crawford faded from Millbrook's halls, Thomas sat alone, the weight of their ultimatum pressing down on him like iron shackles. He had enough evidence to bring the entire network crashing down, but to act on it meant outsmarting men who held sway over courts, militias, and the very pulse of Charleston society. The abolitionists he had once met in Boston, idealists full of conviction, had never imagined the kind of polished brutality and scientific cruelty he now faced. His mission had shifted from gathering information to surviving long enough to reveal it. 3 days later, Thomas made his move. He appeared to embrace the network's offer, arriving at a secret meeting above Henderson's Tavern with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He presented himself as eager, even ambitious, claiming the portfolio contained plans to transform Millbrook into a breeding estate modeled after the Pinckney's facilities. In reality, the case held carefully prepared notes, coded signals, and the means to capture the most damning evidence yet. Marcus Henderson, the tavern's discreet owner, had already agreed to help. A respected free black man in Charleston, Henderson walked a dangerous line between the white elite who drank in his tavern and the enslaved community who sometimes sought his aid. Now his establishment would become the stage for exposing one of the South's darkest secrets. Hidden in the tavern's beams and behind decorative panels were crude but effective listening devices. Mechanical tubes and resonating chambers designed to carry voices to a concealed recording space. For the first time, the network's leaders would be caught speaking in their own words. That night, 9 members gathered: Colonel Drayton, Dr. Huger Crawford, and 7 others, their ranks swelled by the promise of inducting Thomas Whitfield, the Harvard-educated planter, whose credentials offered both prestige and new opportunities. The atmosphere was one of smug triumph. Brandy glasses clinked and compliments flowed as they toasted Thomas's wise decision. Then Dr. Huger took the floor, unveiling a polished presentation filled with charts, figures, and diagrams. He spoke with the clinical pride of a scientist unveiling groundbreaking research. What Thomas heard made his blood run cold. The consortium's reach extended far beyond plantations and ledgers. They had allies in the very halls of academia. Letters displayed from professors at the University of Georgia, the College of Charleston, and even Harvard Medical School offered guidance theories and validation. These men of science lent a sheen of legitimacy, allowing the network to present its atrocities as agricultural innovation. The presentation laid bare ambitions Thomas hadn't dared imagine. Huger described psychological assessment protocols for selecting traits of obedience, discipline, and temperament. He outlined experimental education programs to create skilled workers who could be sold at premium prices in urban markets. He even detailed medical experiments aimed at increasing fertility and reducing infant mortality, carried out under the guise of advancing scientific knowledge. Thomas listened outwardly, nodding inwardly, horrified. The ledger he had copied spoke of numbers and profits. But this meeting revealed something deeper. A system entwined not only with wealth and politics, but with the very institutions that claimed to be the guardians of knowledge. The breeding consortium had given slavery the mask of science, making its cruelty seem not only acceptable, but progressive. And now, in the flickering lamplight above Henderson's Tavern, Thomas had them exactly where he needed them, their own voices betraying their secrets. For nearly 2 hours, Thomas played his part flawlessly, nodding at their twisted science, asking sharp questions at just the right moments, even unrolling architectural sketches for turning Millbrook into a model breeding estate. The drawings showed examination rooms, nurseries, and what he called genetic documentation centers, so precise and efficient that Huger himself praised the ingenuity. Several men asked for copies to replicate the design on their own plantations. When Thomas spoke of contacts in Texas and Arkansas, Eager to establish operations where land was cheap and oversight weak, the room buzzed with excitement. Expansion meant profits, and profits meant power. Then Thomas shifted. With a calmness that masked the pounding of his heart, he opened the second half of his portfolio. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "I believe these records demonstrate not only my grasp of your methods, but my ability to improve upon them." What he laid on the table was not a proposal, it was an indictment. Page after page of documents copied from the network's own registry, breeding schedules, medical charts, financial ledgers, personal correspondence. Letters from Virginia detailing over 300 enslaved people forced into breeding programs. Reports from Georgia describing alliances with traders who scoured markets for men and women with desirable traits. And most damning of all, financial records showing more than $800,000 in profits funneled into political influence and territorial expansion. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then realization crashed over them. Thomas had not come to join their conspiracy. He had come to expose it. The silence lasted only seconds before Crawford moved his hand, darting inside his coat. But Thomas had prepared for this moment. His weighted walking stick cracked across Crawford's wrist before the pistol could clear its holster, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. At that instant, the emergency plan he and Marcus Henderson had built into every detail of the night came to life. The sound of shattering glass rang from the tavern below, the prearranged signal that Henderson's allies, abolitionists, freedmen, and sympathetic workers were moving into position. The private room dissolved into chaos. Huger lunged for the scattered documents while Drayton barked frantic orders to seal the exits. But the exits were already compromised, watched from alleys and stairwells by men ready to stop any escape. The conspirators, so accustomed to control, now found themselves caged, their careful secrecy undone. Thomas shoved the most damning records into his coat and fought his way to the window, swinging his stick to keep his attackers back. The pane shattered as he hurled himself through, crashing into the alley below. The landing knocked the wind from him, but his grip on the documents never loosened. Behind him, shouts erupted, some demanding pursuit, others insisting the evidence had to be destroyed before it reached the light of day. But the moment of perfect order that had defined their network was gone. The breeding consortium had been thrust into panic, and Thomas, battered but alive, clutched in his arms the proof that could tear their empire apart. Thomas's escape had never been an act of desperation. It was the climax of a plan months in the making. While the network scrambled to contain him, believing their grip on Charleston remained unshakable, they failed to realize that copies of the registry letters and financial records had already been smuggled out through a web of allies. Every document Thomas carried that night had duplicates scattered like seeds into the hands of abolitionists, printers, and sympathetic sailors who would carry them north by dawn. Even if Thomas fell on that dock, the truth would survive him. As the network's leaders rushed into the streets, they expected their emergency plans to corner and silence him. Instead, they found themselves hemmed in by faces they hadn't anticipated: freed blacks, dock workers, and abolitionists who had quietly taken up positions throughout the waterfront. What looked like a frantic chase was actually a performance designed to draw Charleston's most powerful conspirators into the open. When Thomas reached the Cooper River docks, it was not as a fugitive, but as the centerpiece of a public reckoning. The waiting boat carried not just provisions for escape, but a hidden press and bundles of evidence ready to flood the city. Marcus, the sailor, they thought incapacitated, was in fact orchestrating distribution routes that would push the story into every corner of Charleston before sunrise. The network believed they had sprung a trap, but in truth, they were walking into one. The confrontation came in the form of Crawford, stepping from the shadows with pistol drawn, flanked by men whose names carried weight at Charleston's grandest tables. These were not mercenaries, but society's most respected judges. planters and politicians revealed now as enforcers of a system built on systematic breeding and human commodification. Mr. Whitfield Crawford declared, his tone clipped and lethal. "You forced our hand. The documents will be destroyed and your silence ensured permanently." Thomas did not flinch. Instead, he smiled and raised his voice so that the crowd gathered at the waterfront could hear. "Gentlemen, you're too late. The evidence you seek to bury is already in the hands of journalists, abolitionists, and federal officers from Boston to Philadelphia. Tonight's meeting was not just observed, it was recorded. What you have built in secrecy will now be judged in the light of day." The words struck like gunfire. For years, the network had thrived on secrecy, its strength lying in silence and control. Now those same systems collapsed under the weight of exposure. In an instant, the hunters became the hunted, their reputations and fortunes as vulnerable as the lives they had so long exploited. What followed on the dock would never be agreed upon. Some claimed shots were fired, others insisted the standoff dissolved into chaos and retreat. But the aftermath was undeniable. The documents Thomas released rippled outward, reaching abolitionist newspapers, congressional offices, and northern pulpits. The Charleston breeding conspiracy, once hidden in ledgers and whispered parlors, became a scandal too large to ignore. And though Thomas's fate that night remained shrouded in rumor, some said he escaped upriver, others that he was taken and silenced. His actions ignited a firestorm. For the first time, Americans were forced to reckon not only with the brutality of slavery, but with its transformation into an industrialized science of human exploitation. The revelations reshaped the national conversation and pushed the debate over slavery further into the halls of power, accelerating the conflict that would one day tear the nation apart. Instead of fleeing or attempting the hopeless task of fighting armed men, Thomas chose the one tactic his enemies had never anticipated. He opened the registry in his hands and began reading its contents aloud. His voice carried across the harbor, echoing off the water, as he recited names, dates, and specific records of births, deaths, and forced pairings. He spoke of profits earned from the bodies of enslaved women, of letters exchanged with traders and doctors, and of breeding schedules that mapped human lives like cattle stock. Each detail pointed not only to the men standing before him, but to dozens of Charleston's most respected families, their reputations unraveling with every word. This was no last-minute act of desperation. It was the cornerstone of Thomas's plan. He knew that bullets could silence him, but not the witnesses gathering along the docks. Sailors, dock workers, late-night travelers, even families leaning from upstairs windows, all were drawn by the shocking testimony carried on his voice. With each line, the circle of listeners widened, and with it the number of witnesses who could testify to what they had heard. Crawford and the others realized they were trapped in an impossible bind. If they killed Thomas now, the gathered crowd would see it as confirmation of guilt. If they let him continue, he would expose every secret they had guarded for 2 decades. Thomas pressed the advantage, shifting from records of births to correspondence that revealed ties to academic institutions, medical practitioners, and slave traders who scoured markets for desirable stock. He spoke of alliances with families in Virginia and Georgia, naming names that caused murmurs and gasps from the crowd. He read aloud financial accounts showing hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into political influence. The audience, once passive, became personal. Freed blacks recognized family names, recalling relatives taken from them. Formerly enslaved men and women connected their own tragedies to the patterns in the documents. Even some white onlookers, who had unknowingly dealt with these same planters, realized they had brushed against the edges of a conspiracy that treated people like commodities. By the time the Charleston constables arrived, the situation had shifted beyond their control. What had begun as a clandestine showdown on the docks had become a public trial by revelation. Dozens of witnesses now carried pieces of the truth in their memory. The constables, many of them beholden to the same elites Thomas had implicated, found themselves paralyzed. To act against him would invite outrage. To act against the network meant dismantling the very hierarchy that sustained Charleston's power. When the officers finally approached, Thomas did not resist. He handed them the portfolio and allowed himself to be taken into custody. By then the damage was done. The registry and correspondence were no longer secrets. Too many eyes and ears had seen and heard the evidence. Dr. Huger tried to rally, dismissing the documents as forgeries crafted by northern radicals. Yet the precision of the details, the names of children, the medical charts, the signatures of Charleston's most esteemed men made denial nearly impossible. That night, the breeding network's strength, its secrecy, its sophistication, its careful entanglement with wealth and politics collapsed under the weight of public exposure. What had been hidden in ledgers and parlors spilled into the streets of Charleston, and the echoes of Thomas's words would ripple far beyond the docks all the way to the floor of Congress. The moment Thomas began reading from the registry, the conspiracy unraveled in ways the network could not contain. Several in the crowd, dock workers, freed blacks, and former slaves, recognized names, dates, and even descriptions that matched events they themselves had lived through. Families recalled children taken without explanation. Workers remembered sudden transfers of men and women, and traders recognized financial arrangements they had once facilitated. Their recognition provided instant validation of Thomas's words, turning rumor into undeniable fact. The shockwave that followed tore through Charleston's elite like a firestorm. Families scrambled to shield themselves, distancing their names from the registry, even as they hired lawyers and quietly tried to bribe witnesses. The evidence, however, was too systematic to allow for selective denial. Thomas hadn't uncovered fragments. He had revealed an entire machine of exploitation, meticulously recorded in ledgers, letters, and financial statements. The consortium's leaders faced a cruel choice attempt, a full-scale cover-up that risked drawing even more attention or abandoned the breeding operations that had brought them staggering profits. By morning, copies of the evidence were in circulation beyond Charleston. Couriers carried packets to newspaper offices in Savannah, Richmond, and Philadelphia, where abolitionist publishers immediately recognized their value. For years, abolitionists had claimed systematic breeding programs existed. Now, they had hard proof. Pamphlets, editorials, and speeches soon drew directly from Thomas's documents, their impact magnified by the sheer volume and precision of the records. At the federal level, investigators who had been quietly monitoring interstate slave trading violations suddenly had a goldmine of evidence. The correspondence Thomas had exposed directly implicated respected judges, legislators, and merchants, transforming the issue from a regional scandal into a national political crisis. Thomas himself disappeared from Charleston within days, though this was no panicked flight. His extraction had been planned in advance, with abolitionist allies. Moved through a network of safe houses, he eventually resurfaced in Philadelphia, where he worked for months alongside journalists and investigators. His first-hand knowledge of the consortium's operations became the backbone for a wave of new inquiries that exposed similar breeding networks in Georgia, Virginia, and Mississippi. The consortium's counterattack was swift and brutal. Dock workers and sailors who had witnessed Thomas's reading found themselves approached with bribes, promises of land, or threats of ruin. When money failed, violence followed. Witnesses were attacked in alleys, disappeared on nighttime roads, or were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Yet these very acts of intimidation backfired. Investigators began treating the disappearances as evidence of guilt, folding each new crime into a growing dossier that only strengthened the case against the network. Meanwhile, desperate plantation owners tried to erase their own paper trails. Ledgers were burned, letters destroyed, and breeding facilities hastily dismantled. But the very structure of the enterprise, the records kept across states. The architectural modifications to plantation quarters, the extensive correspondence between partners meant total erasure was impossible. Traces of the program appeared everywhere in financial ledgers sent to banks, in invoices from slave traders, in notes exchanged with physicians and professors. The same system that had made the consortium so powerful, its reliance on meticulous records and multi-state coordination, became the noose around its neck. In the months that followed, what had once been whispered in parlors and hidden in safes became the subject of congressional debates, abolitionist campaigns, and criminal investigations. The network's secrecy was gone forever, replaced by a trail of evidence too vast and too public to contain. Even as members of the Charleston breeding network scrambled to burn ledgers, dismantle facilities, and relocate their families, the damage had already been done. Enough records survived to reconstruct the enterprise's structure, trace its profits, and implicate individuals who Thomas himself had never named. Their flight from Charleston, abandoning Mansion's businesses and long-held social positions, was read by the public as proof of guilt rather than innocent retreat. Investigators followed the money and the people, uncovering parallel breeding operations in Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina that mirrored the methods Thomas had exposed. The financial blow was devastating. The systematic programs that once generated staggering profits relied entirely on secrecy to sustain inflated prices. With exposure came collapse. Buyers refused to purchase enslaved people bred in operations tainted by scandal, rendering once prized facilities and carefully managed stock worthless. Families that had invested heavily in breeding quarters, physicians, and specialized overseers suddenly found themselves ruined. For the Pinckneys, the scandal struck with particular cruelty. Margaret, whose trust had allowed Thomas access, suffered a nervous collapse when she learned the true purpose of his courtship and the full scope of her family's crimes. Her heartbreak mirrored Charleston society's broader reckoning, the genteel facades of its most respected families now revealed as masks for industrialized cruelty. William Pinckney, whose drunken boasts had given Thomas his first glimpse of the network, turned against his father. In exchange for immunity, he offered investigators letters and receipts that confirmed the family's direct involvement. The public quarrels that erupted between father and son destroyed any hope the Pinckneys had of presenting a unified denial. Dr. Huger fared no better. Once celebrated for his medical expertise, he became a pariah when his correspondence with colleges and professors surfaced. Letters revealed how Southern medical schools and even Northern institutions had provided scientific consultation for the network, lending academic legitimacy to what were in truth systematic crimes. The fallout forced public scrutiny of universities and scholars who had quietly enabled the enterprise. The network itself collapsed not through a single courtroom victory, but through the slow erosion of secrecy. Their greatest strength, their meticulous coordination, their reliance on records, their interwoven alliances became the very evidence used to dismantle them. Families went bankrupt as assets were abandoned or confiscated. Political dynasties withered as once respected names became synonymous with breeding programs. Federal investigators, constrained by laws that still recognize slavery, pursued the conspirators under interstate commerce statutes. By proving that the breeding programs had falsified origins, transported enslaved people across state lines under fraudulent documentation, and profited from illegal sales, prosecutors sidestepped the defense of slavery's legality. Several prominent members were convicted of conspiracy and fraud, their fortunes gutted by fines and seizures. Others, though never criminally convicted, lost their standing forever. In the end, the Charleston breeding network was undone by the same qualities that had once made it powerful: its obsession with precision documentation and scale. Once exposed, those very traits ensured its destruction, leaving behind a legacy of scandal that would haunt the South's planter class and fuel abolitionist arguments all the way to the brink of war. Thomas Whitfield's trail vanished in Charleston's aftermath, and for decades, his fate was nothing more than speculation. That changed in the 1920s, when family papers donated to Harvard revealed that he had escaped, surviving long enough to dedicate the rest of his life to underground networks that helped enslaved people reach freedom. His meticulous documentation of the breeding network's operations became some of the most explosive evidence read before Congress in the years leading up to the Civil War. These records gave abolitionists hard proof of the systematic abuses slavery's defenders tried to conceal behind claims of paternalism and benevolence. The master registry itself, the ledger Thomas had risked his life to copy, vanished from the public record after the initial investigations. Many historians suspect that powerful Southern families succeeded in burying it, its contents too damning to acknowledge without unraveling the entire social order of the antebellum South. Yet fragments have surfaced in private estate papers, letters, and ledgers that confirm Charleston was not an isolated case. Similar breeding operations thrived in Virginia, Georgia, and Mississippi, most of them far more successful at destroying evidence than the Charleston conspirators. Modern scholars estimate that tens of thousands of enslaved people may have been forced into such programs. Human reproduction reduced to an industrial process designed for profit. The Charleston exposure stands out because it was caught in the open, a rare glimpse into practices that were otherwise hidden behind locked doors and burned records. Its impact reached far beyond South Carolina, shaping the national debate on slavery and human rights. Abolitionists could now point to irrefutable proof of slavery's dehumanizing nature, while defenders found themselves unable to explain away scientific charts that treated people as livestock. The story is more than a local scandal. It's a warning. It shows how systems of cruelty can operate with precision and respectability when cloaked in scientific language and protected by powerful social institutions. The Charleston breeding network was not the work of a few twisted minds. It was an institutional machine requiring wealth, intellect, and coordination. And it took one man's courage, careful planning, and relentless documentation to tear a hole in its secrecy. So, what do you think? Was the truth fully revealed, or are there still secrets buried beneath Charleston's history? The evidence suggests the Charleston network was just one example of a much larger system, most of which disappeared into ash and silence. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how systemic abuse can hide inside respected institutions. And if you want more dark historical mysteries that uncover the hidden machinery of America's past, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The past is never as distant as it seems, and its shadows still shape the world we live in today.